Greetings my chess friends, and I'd like to welcome you to this chess video, and we're going to do a little video on how to solve tactical puzzles. Now normally what happens is that chess players simply try to find the solution. They look at forcing lines, they try to visualise the outcome and try to find the solution. I personally think a much more productive method is to apply our general chess understanding and try to understand the problem prior to looking at candidate moves. Now, how do we in fact do this? Well, we look primarily at the pieces and their position and, importantly, the function of the chess pieces. Now, we know that the underlying principle of a chess game is activity, the mobility of the chess pieces. Therefore, what we do when we look at tactical problems is we try to identify those pieces which have a limited mobility, either because of their position or because of some function that they are utilising at that present time, some defensive function. Let's take a look at this example here. We systematically go through the chessmen of our opponent and try and identify those pieces which have a limited mobility, primarily because of their position or because of some function that they are engaged in at present. So we start with the most valuable piece, the king. And we can see that the king in this instance has absolutely no mobility whatsoever. He has no squares he can go to. So we keep that in mind. It's something that we should be able to exploit. The queen in this position, she has fairly good mobility. And her function would seem to be to look after the rook here on g7. So maybe she's involved, maybe she's not. It doesn't seem that she's particularly critical. The other rook on g8, its function is to defend the rook on g7. And it's a little bit precarious because this rook is attacked twice and defended twice. So we may be able to exploit it. As for the bishops, well, they don't really take part. Their function is fairly limited, and certainly their mobility is limited as well, but they don't seem primarily important, not as do the pawns. So we focus on these three pieces: the king, the rooks and the queen. And we can see that out of all these pieces, the rook on g7 is the most vulnerable. Simply put, it cannot leave the g-file, because if it does, then the rook on g8 will hang. So this rook here has practically limited mobility. It can never move from the g-file. We've already identified that the king has no mobility, and therefore we look at our own chess pieces and see how we can exploit these factors. We first of all look at checks, then captures, and then forcing moves. Now, do we have in this position a check which exploits the vulnerability of the king and the rook on g7? And the answer is in fact yes. We can play queen takes h7 check, the most powerful and the most forcing move in this position. Now, Black cannot take with the king, because if he takes with the king, he will be mated like this. So he has to take with the rook. And as we noted earlier, this rook cannot move from the g-file, but it's forced to. And the result is that we can exploit its lack of mobility and the lack of mobility of the black king by issuing mate on g8. So this is how we approach tactical problems. We look for pieces that lack mobility and we try and exploit that lack of mobility. Because activity, as we know, is the underlying principle which governs all chess games. So let's take a look at another example, and we'll try and identify vulnerabilities prior to looking at specific variations. Here's another very interesting position. Let's look at our opponent's pieces, starting with the most valuable first. And we notice that the king is very limited in its mobility. In fact, it is only one square to go to. The queen has quite good mobility. There is some contact with our queen, but otherwise it has good mobility, as does the rooks and the bishop and the knight. So we need to go back and take a closer look at this king. Can we exploit it by reducing its mobility to an absolute minimum? Do we have any checks, any captures, or any forcing moves which help us do that? And we can see that with our knight we have a check by playing knight d7, which forces the king into the corner. Again, we look for checks, captures, or forcing moves. And we can see that we have a check on a7 with our queen. We visualise that queen takes a7, the king must take. And can we follow it up with another check? And we find that we do. We have rook to a5, mating the black king. So let's play it out on the board. Queen takes, exploiting the lack of mobility of the white king. King is forced to take. We look for other checks because it's the most forcing. And we can find rook to a5, checkmate. And this is the thought process that we go through, trying to identify and find vulnerabilities of our opponent's chessmen, either because of their position or because of some function that they are presently engaged in. So we'll take a look at another one and see how this thought process helps us find the correct moves. Okay, here's another tactical position, and again we go through our opponent's pieces, starting with the most valuable. And again we can see that the king has absolutely limited mobility. It is only one square it can go to on h8. We look at the queen, and the queen would seem to have quite good mobility. She's not presently engaged in any serious defensive tasks. This rook also has quite good mobility. It's not engaged in any serious defensive tasks. And this rook here, well, it essentially has to guard the back rank. Because if it ever moves from the back rank, we can see that black would be facing checkmate with rook to e8. So this rook here has absolutely limited mobility. It can never move in this position from the back rank. Now what that means is that its defensive tasks are severely reduced. In fact, this pawn here would seem to be guarded, but it's not in fact guarded at all, because the rook cannot move. Now, can we exploit these factors? The vulnerability of the king, which has no mobility, and the vulnerability of the rook, which has limited mobility. And the answer is yes. We first of all look for checks, captures, and then forcing moves. And we find that we have queen takes f7 check, the most forcing move. There's only really one reply. Rook takes queen on f7, and we can see now that the rook has been forced to give up its position guarding the back rank, and we can essentially deliver another check, forcing the rook back, and of course forcing checkmate on f8. And this, of course, was due to the lack of mobility of both the king and the rook, which we identified prior to looking at variations. And this is the way we solve chess tactics. We try to understand the position prior to looking at variations by looking at the function of the pieces and looking at their relative mobility or lack of mobility. So we'll look at some more. This is quite an interesting position from an endgame, and going through our technique of looking at the opponent's pieces and checking their mobility, we can see that black's king has fairly good mobility. Of course it cannot penetrate beyond the 7th rank, but its mobility is okay. We look at the rook on e8, and we can see that it has limited ability because it of course must guard this bishop here on b8. So it cannot really move beyond the 8th rank. Its mobility is somewhat limited. This bishop here has absolutely no mobility, because if it was ever to move from the 8th rank, then quite simply white would promote either one of these pawns. It cannot of course take this bishop here, because then this pawn duo on the 7th rank, one of these pawns would promote and white would be absolutely winning. So its mobility is absolutely zero. Now, can we exploit these two factors, the lack of mobility of the black rook and the lack of mobility of the black bishop? And the answer is yes. We can play rook to c7, knowing that this bishop cannot move. And because it cannot move, all of these squares that it was influencing are essentially unprotected, and we can move there with impunity. Of course the bishop cannot take, and our idea quite simply, after black say plays a move, we'll just give black a move, is to play rook to c8, and the rook cannot take because we'll simply promote, and the bishop of course cannot take, or the bishop rather cannot move, otherwise we'll simply just take the rook. So again, this highlights looking at the mobility of the pieces prior to looking for candidate moves, identifying which pieces have limited mobility, and trying to identify how we can exploit that lack of mobility. And finally, chess friends, here is an interesting position. So let us apply our technique. We systematically go through our opponent's pieces, starting for the most valuable first, and we try to ascertain the piece's mobility. Now, looking at this position here, we can see that the king has a somewhat limited mobility. He looks safe behind the pawns, but he might be vulnerable along this diagonal here. Next we go to the queen. And the queen is actually quite interesting because she has very limited mobility if you look at the position. She cannot go here and she cannot go here because of the knight. She cannot go here because of the pawn. She also cannot go here because of a pawn. And she cannot go here or here. So she has, in effect, three squares that she can go to at present. So her mobility is absolutely limited. Now, can we find a way to exploit this? And the answer is yes. If we look at our bishop, we can see that it can take away a further two squares, this one and this one, from the black queen, leaving the black queen a single square. We can do this with the move bishop to e2. Now the queen has two squares she can now go to. She can go here or she can go here. It doesn't really matter. If she goes here, we will absolutely pin her to the king, winning her. And if she goes here, the result, of course, is the same. We'll skewer her against the king, winning her. So we were able to identify all of these components because we simply looked at the mobility of the chess pieces. And it's a very, very good technique, chess friends, for utilizing while we are doing tactical puzzles. It's essentially quite useless just to think that we are a chess machine and we can simply calculate everything. We are not chess machines, we are human beings. And we think like human beings. We simply cannot go to a position and start to calculate. We must first try to understand the position and apply our chess understanding and then look for viable candidate moves. And if you do this, my chess friends, your chess understanding will grow and you will get immense joy from doing little tactical puzzles like this. Because you will understand why the tactic works. Anyhow, thank you very, very much for taking the time. I hope you can apply this technique, looking at the lack of mobility of chess pieces, either because of some function they perform or because of their position, that you systematically go through your opponent's chessmen looking for these vulnerabilities, and you look for powerful forcing moves which enable you to exploit them. Checks first, captures next, and forcing moves second. So thank you for taking the time to watch this chess video, and I sincerely wish you well with your own chess. Take care and goodbye.